Losing one's legs is losing one's voice. That can be literal, as when ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease eventually robs a person of the ability to speak. That can also be figurative, as when the inability to walk limits a person's independence. And we know freedom of movement is really the power to choose where to go, to choose when to go, to choose how to go. Yes, losing one's legs is losing one's voice. Rebecca Solnit argues for the power of walking in her essay Footwork. She writes, "The demonstrated truth is that to walk the same route again can mean to think the same thoughts again. Thoughts can be, as it were, objects in a landscape that become visible through movement. In this way, walking is thinking." The way we protested was influenced by Thoreau and by the women's suffrage movement, insofar as it was civil disobedience. But whereas Thoreau and the suffragists protested primarily through immobility or inaction, we protested by walking. For Solnit, walking has many purposes. Walking the same path as one's heroes can be contemplative. Walking to sacred sites during pilgrimages can be spiritual. Walking in nature can be restorative, and walking as protest can be a form of freedom of speech. Solnit worries about how modernization is fundamentally altering the natural landscape. She worries that walking fads like jogging diminish the power of a good traditional walk. Yet, what Solnit does not really deal with is glaring in its absence. What about those who cannot walk at all? What about those who have had the power of walking taken from them by disease, by accidents, by biology? For if Solnit is right, and walking is a form of freedom and a form of speech, then cannot we say that those who lose their legs lose their voices too? I know this. I am a product of it. On both sides of my family, the loss of mobility has had devastating effects. The loss of legs has meant the loss of voice. My great-great-grandmother, Lucia Padula, was born in 1890. 1904. Married at Santa Maria Adelaide Church. She was 14 when she married my great-great-grandfather Antonio, who was 18. Her dress was made by a family friend for $20, a big sum then for such a poor family. They would be married for 52 years until Lucia died after having raised 8 children. Lucia loved family events. She would go to every wedding, every party. She was an independent woman, very much the matriarch of the family. She loved to cook and more, to share that cooking with those around her. But diabetes would take a terrible toll. In March 1952, she would lose her right leg as a result of her disease. That leg would be buried on March 28, 1952, separately in the gravesite she and her husband had pre-bought, awaiting the day she would join it. She would try to navigate with only a single leg. One day, her independent spirit showed when her husband Antonio learned that in order to get a cookie sheet, she had crawled up several flights of stairs on her hands and knees. He asked why she did not wait for him to get it for her. She said she could get it herself. But that independent spirit would not continue. Remember always, the loss of legs means the loss of voice. In 1956, Lucia would lose her other leg. It too would be buried, waiting for her to join. It would not be a long wait. Unable to move at all now because she had lost both her legs, Lucia withered. Her spirit was broken. Because of the technological limitations and limited accommodations for the handicapped during the 1950s, she could no longer cook on her own. She could not go to family parties easily or on her own anymore. She became dependent on others for her movement. She lost her freedom. Lucia would pass away on April 1st, 1956. She would finally join her amputated legs. Perhaps in the afterlife she regained the freedom that had been stolen by her diabetes. Lucia's grandson, my grandfather, and my father's father, Vincent Tenuto, would share a similar fate as his grandmother, albeit for another reason. My grandfather Vincent was known by his nickname Puffy, a symbol of his big and booming personality. Grandpa Puffy was born on November 8th, 1929. His parents were poor, yet religious, and he was devoted to St. Joseph his entire life. Because of his poverty and the loss of his mother, who died when he was 16, my grandfather never had an easy life. What poverty gave him, though, was a love of hard work. Here he is working at the Pittsburgh Glass Company, ironically located in Chicago despite its name. He worked for them for many years, never completing high school because he had to choose between eating or reading. But you can see the joy in his face that work brought my grandfather. He loved going to work, especially because it meant he could take care of his family. This is my grandpa on October 5th, 1952. It is his wedding day when he married my grandmother, Josephine. They would be married for 62 years until Grandpa died. They had 5 boys, including my father, John. Here's a picture of them. Grandpa took care of his family by working many jobs. He was a Chicago police officer. He worked for streets and sanitation. He worked in hot dog stands. And he did carpentry work. His family and religion gave Grandpa joy. He was an active man. He loved sports, even from when he was very young. Here he is playing basketball at the local Samaritan House for poor kids. A Cubs fan, a dancer. He would spend months and hundreds of hours a year volunteering to run St. Joseph's charity events with my grandmother. He loved the outdoors. Grandpa Puffy had 2 worst days. The first was June 20th, 1988. While at work, he was informed that one of his sons, Nicholas, was killed by an ex-convict, high on drugs, who, while driving to get more drugs, hit my Uncle Nick's Chicago Tribune truck while he was driving. The truck was hit so powerfully that my uncle was tossed from the truck. The truck turned over on its side and crushed my uncle to death. You can see here my grandpa's writing on his desk calendar. He wrote, "My Nicky died today. I love him very much." The second worst day was January 20th, 2009. That would be the last day Grandpa Puffy would walk on his own. A form of Parkinson's disease was taking slowly his ability to walk until on that day his leg finally gave out. He would not walk again without the aid of a walker, and then, within 6 months, not at all. Grandpa changed after that. The city of Chicago, who benefited from his hard work for more than 60 years and had saved millions of dollars for taxpayers because of his innovations, diminished him by forcibly retiring him. Since he could not walk, the mayor of Chicago thought my grandfather had no value. For a man who defined himself by work, that forced retirement took his spirit. No longer able to go to work, no longer able to go anywhere without help, my grandfather withered. The powerful man would weep when he had to have others help him to the bathroom. He lost his legs. He was actually and metaphorically strapped into place. He lost his voice. I don't remember my grandfather, Puffy, ever walking. I remember him reading to me and joking with me. I remember his love, but I don't remember him ever moving. My grandpa died on March 25th, 2013. When he died, He did so with the St. Joseph statue in his hand. The doctor said his death was brought on by a respiratory problem, caused by his lack of walking. That day, my grandpa lost his voice permanently. My mother's father, Grandpa Jose Paya Diaz, never met my Grandpa Puffy. They had a lot in common, though. Both were Cubs fans, both are religious, and both would be lost to us because of their legs and their inability to walk. Grandpa Jose was born on April 10th, 1947, in the same town my mother will be born in nearly 30 years later, a tiny village in the Valencia region, in the town of Sax, Spain. His mother would die when he was 2 years old, and it would be him and his father, Victorino, on their own, trying to survive together. Grandpa found happiness in many things. From playing with toys to playing outdoors with his cousins. It seemed like the town of Sax that nearly everyone was a relative. He took solace in his religion. He loved walking in the town and spending time with family and friends. He grew into a handsome man who played the drums and sang in his own band and who served in his nation's military. One thing about my Grandpa Jose that you may notice is that he was not a tall man. An irony because his wife, my grandmother Adria, was more than a foot taller than Grandpa Jose. They used to call her Jirafa, Spanish for giraffe, because of her height compared to his. Yet they both loved one another greatly. That love would be put to an ultimate test. Now in the United States, my grandpa was working as a dishwasher when he began to drop plates frequently. His boss thought it was because he was drunk, because of course all Spanish people are drunks according to those with prejudiced hearts. The reality was my grandfather Jose was starting to show the early signs of ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Piece by piece, his body would betray him. By 1982, he could not walk at all, confined to a wheelchair. His arms would fail next. My mother never remembers seeing her father walk. As his neck muscles atrophied, he would need to have a feeding tube installed in his stomach. To go outside was a chore. My family was too poor to afford a lift, so they had to carry him by hand down several flights of stairs. Eventually, he lost his voice and could not speak near the end. He died on April 1st, 1987. My mother was 12. When she went to school, all the kids thought she was lying about his death as an April Fool's joke. The real joke was the cruelty of the disease. It robbed a man who loved movement and music, who loved his family, who worked to take care of them, from his freedom. It robbed him of his voice, in both actuality and symbolically. You can see in this picture a man longing to rise, to walk, to be free. Grandpa Jose had an unusual hobby. He loved to collect and read airplane schedules from the airport. He would memorize those tables, knowing when flights left and when they arrived. I wonder if he thought so much about airplanes because he too wanted to fly free. But he couldn't. Lucia couldn't. Grandpa Vince couldn't. No legs, no voice. So when Sonnet complains about jogging and modernizations and that they're sapping some of the enjoyment of walking from the experience, I can sympathize, but only to a degree. You see, for those who cannot walk at all, any kind of walk would be a joy.